Hello, this is J.R. Fibonacci. This is September 28th. This blog entry and audio is called Practical Opportunism versus Idealistic Agonizing. I think a lot of people in just the word practical opportunism, they might have a reaction just to that word opportunism. Ooh, bad, or ooh, interesting. I'm not sure. Different people might have different responses. So we'll start with a couple questions. Which is more relevant to you, more economical to you, a higher priority for you? To invest your time in promoting that certain ideas about effective healthcare be spread to the masses, perhaps paid for by others through coerced taxes like a particular government or a particular charity, whatever it may be, will spread certain ideas to the masses, for instance, about healthcare. Is that the priority for you relative to investing your time in using effective healthcare methods personally? And it's understandable, of course, that somebody might want to share what's been valuable to them, things that they're grateful for. You may want to share. You may even want it to be shared to millions of people. Or you might just do it one at a time, or maybe dozens or hundreds. So beyond your physical health, which is more relevant to you, a higher priority, more economical for you? To invest your time in election campaigns and government interventions, Keynesian interventions to prevent economic cycles, such as winter and then spring and then summer and then fall and then winter, right? Or to invest your time in benefiting from clarity about the reality of economic cycles. Because there are economic cycles, just like let's say that there might be economic cycles. If there are some, would the best thing for you to be to prevent them, minimize them, or to recognize them and benefit from them? Are you more interested in benefiting from stuff, being clear about stuff and benefiting from it, or preventing what's already here from being here now? It's kind of a basic spiritual question, even. Well, let's move on. How about investing time in blaming others for their lack of initiative in regard to producing the results that you value? So, right now I've got certain results. I could put a lot of time into blaming certain groups of people, certain specific people, for their lack of initiative in regard to not producing the results that I value now. I could also criticize them for their initiative in regard to producing what's present now. Who's to blame for how things are now in my life or in any particular realm, such as the planet or the state of Arizona or the city or the zip code where I'm in? What group am I going to criticize for what's currently here? Or am I not going to criticize any group for what's currently here? Am I going to focus on what's currently here and how to benefit from it? So am I going to blame as my basic orientation? Like specify particular people or a particular person, blame them? Or am I going to focus on what I value producing, what I am grateful for that's presently here, what I'd like to cultivate more? That's the basic question I'm asking. Now I changed my tone a little bit here in the next section. Now, because I know that telegraphs are the best thing in the world, and I know that I'm right about that obvious fact, I'm going to promote a government intervention to ban ridiculous technologies like telephones, which even Amish people are starting to use now, which proves that telephones are evil, inherently evil and bad for the environment. I want the government of my zip code right here, this particular zip code, I want the government of this zip code to make my favorite industry, telegraphs, stronger and steadier and wealthier, for the good of the people and for the environment and all that stuff. To promote telegraphs. It's the right thing to do. We need to protect humanity from all threats to the telegraph industry, such as telephones, but perhaps also the postal system and emails. Oh my gosh, the internet. We need brave, wise leaders to do what is right and to fulfill the final solution to permanently solve all the problems of the masses and to make heaven on earth now. Keep that in mind next Tuesday when you cast your vote for the future of sanity. That's a quotation from Adolf Hitler in his 1936 speech condemning the existence of the American Telegraph and Telephone Company. That's right, not just American Telephone Company, but Telegraph and Telephone, AT&T. You know what? I'm actually recording this right now on it's an iPhone from Apple, but I have AT&T mobile phone service on it. I guess I'm a little hypocritical there, aren't I? Unless I was joking in all that part. Well, before I get on to the actual point of all that, I'm going to pause. I'll be right back. So, as I told you, the title to all of this is Practical Opportunism versus Idealistic Agonizing. We're going to talk about a spirit of calm and composure and acceptance and clarity. And to talk about that is going to put some other things in contrast that are not that. So I'll say a little now in general about my research across the last decade or so, including on the subject of economics, including personal economics or my personal values and how they're influencing my behaviors or how they show up in my behaviors. In other words, what I do reflect my values, and my values correspond to what I actually do. I'm not just talking about what I say I value or what I say I appreciate, but what I actually do. So my actual personal economic priorities, my actual personal priorities, in other words, as in my psychology, I can safely presume that much of what is beyond what I've said so far will be unfamiliar to most people reading this. At least some of it will be unfamiliar to most people reading or listening to this. So to anyone unfamiliar with economics, you can just ignore brief references to economic terminology that's unfamiliar, like any of the following. I'm going to cover psychology. I'm going to cover a little bit about politics, but it's really also about, people criticizing and blaming others. It's very practical. You could call this a philosophy thing, but I'm going to make reference to economics occasionally. So in economics, or in economic forecasting, my research has focused precisely on resolving a gap between two things. I'm going to ask you to imagine a trunk of a tree and then the leaves of a tree. There's stuff between the leaves and the trunk. Have you noticed that? So in economics, there's something called fundamental analysis, which is about supply and demand and other very basic things. Inventory. You could even say things like accounts receivable and credits and accounts payable and, accounting and law and that kind of basic stuff. And then there's this other thing, I don't know if economics is what to call it, but in financial forecasting, there's this other aspect called technical analysis. It's very detail-oriented. It's about basically the measuring of momentum and trends. Momentum and trends, which basically are the same thing. Momentum is trends. So my research has been about connecting really basic stuff, being really clear about really basic stuff, and connecting it to specific details in the changing of trends and in the measuring of trends. Trends like real estate prices, borrowing and selling of real estate, in terms of the number of transactions in a given time period in a given geographic range. The number of mortgage applications is related. All of these things can be used in predicting other things. So as the number of mortgage applications goes up or down, the number of mortgage approvals may predictably go up or down, and the number of completed transactions may go up or down, and so on. So back to the analogy. So there's these foundations, supply, demand, and so forth. And then there's measurements, very specific measurements. Price is a kind of measurement, like the average sale price or the average length of time that it takes for a listing of real estate to actually be completed and to close, to have a sale of that home that's been listed. So those are just measurements. There's a connection between supply and demand, and then those various measurements and numeric values, like price. In fact, when I'm talking about supply and demand, I'm not going to get into this at all in this article, but we count, when we're talking about supply, we count demand, we measure them. So then we measure changes in supply and demand. So back to the thing about there's the trunk of a tree and then there's the leaves and then there's something in between. Well, there's no inherent reason for any gap between the process of how trunks work and how leaves work. They go together. And the fact that there are branches in between the two is just obvious. Anybody can notice that. In regard to economics and forecasting, if somebody's clear about the basics, there's no real issue of how to connect the basics to the specifics. If there's a lack of clarity about the basics, then the specifics may reveal the lack of clarity about the basics. So, an analogy of what my experience has been in regard to studying economics and talking with people about it is that it's like studying how trunks form into limbs, and then people say, I understand that, and then people skip over and then talk about how little branches spread into leaves, but they don't address the middle connections, the middle stages. So between those two studies and the issue of limbs, between those two studies of trunks and leaves is the issue of limbs spreading into branches and branches spreading into leaves. And it's, again, consistent with the other two studies of trunks and studies of leaves. So for people to study the two isolated areas but not what connects them is, in my opinion, not especially useful. It's actually, I use the word retarded. Like there's no such thing as branches. So within my study of economics, many people may be challenged or even frightened by certain subject matter. That might explain why they skip over things and why they might say, well, this stuff's confusing. Well, maybe it's actually very clear and it just reveals flaws in a particular conceptual model, and rather than address the issues and flaws within their conceptual model, they just ignore all branches. They just focus on trunks and leaves as if there's no such thing as branches. So my research goes from linguistics, the origin of words and the use of words, to philosophy, and then to history and the law. And I mention that because when we're talking about economics and accounting and finances, we're talking about things like units of currency and how they are formed and how they collapse, how they change over time, as well as how markets are formed. Markets are phenomenon within social, within society. So law is the court systems and so forth. Governments are relevant when we're talking about markets, from stock markets to the market for telegraphs. So how they're formed and how they collapse, what they're for, what they do, and so on. It's all very ecological, like I mentioned with all the branch and tree. So we have all of those factors that we'll just call history, including the history of language. And then we get into what I call garage sale economics. What I mean by that is really practical economics that anybody who's been to a garage sale or held a garage sale would recognize. It's just the agreements that people make. When somebody values $2 more than a particular item for sale at the garage sale, then they'll be willing to accept $2 in exchange for that item. So when there's a difference of valuation by a seller and a buyer, then there may be a transaction, a voluntary transaction. So those are the basics of garage sale economics, and there's lots of other fundamentals that are very simple, involve no, when I say $2, what's a dollar? Well, it could be that somebody values a few books over a you know a CD or something, a music CD. So people will exchange or trade or barter things. Once you get into currency units, you're already involving law and finance and so on, and measurement. But garage sale economics is really basic. It's related to Austrian economics, or the Austrian school of economics. It's pretty simple, pretty practical, pretty accessible stuff. But one of the distinctions between what I do and what tends to happen within the Austrian school, they do address some very simple, basic, practical issues, but they tend to have what I'm calling a ridiculous anti-government idealism. I may be something of an anarchist, but to ignore the existence of governments as economic organisms, I think of as just plain stupid. Governments are functionally boundaries between herds. They're real institutions. They're economic phenomenon, and even Alaska and Arizona can be considered herds. They're herds or groupings of activity, like human activity, like economic activity. They're valid groupings, just as the U.S. and NATO and North America are valid linguistic groupings or categories. So Austrian economics tends not to address the formation of governments and how governments change. But there are fields that do study that. We could call that kind of the branch between the trunk and the leaves, is the formation of patterns of governing and government. What I call systems of organized violence, where there'll be court systems and they say, okay, everybody within our jurisdiction, at least if we can get them to comply with this, we're going to have them give us 20% of their annual whatever. They just declare that. They can be thugs or warlords or Internal Revenue Service or whatever. It's the same basic process. And the Confederacy of the U.S. may claim, legitimacy over a certain territory, and if they can functionally maintain that, then they get to continue to operate. You sometimes have overlapping hierarchies where you have multiple governments, like a city government, a county government, a state government, a federal government, and then international governments like NATO and United Nations and so on. All of these levels can coexist, and then at some point there may be breakdowns of various institutions. But for Austrian economics to address the foundations and then not address the formation of branches just seems dumb. And for them to critically, condemn governments is just dumb. So then you get, ultimately to how do basic economic issues influence things like the formation and transition of political systems, and then how does that influence things like specific behavior of people, like, purchases of gasoline or homes or borrowing of money, payment of taxes, how they use their time, what kind of diets they eat, all that kind of stuff. So for a foundation of clarity, calmness, peace, that kind of thing, practicality, I include sometimes in my writings and economic analysis reference to things like geology, specifically for within the political boundaries of the United States or a particular state such as Alaska or Arizona. I'll refer to geology, such as the presence of various natural resources, minerals, fossil fuels, whatever, how much of it is there, how much of it is extracted, refined, present, available for people to purchase or otherwise to use, such as governments or thieves or whatever it may be. So I include a reference now to Dr. Hubbard, a USGS, a geologist, a United States Geological Survey, is USGS. In 1956, he published references to what has become known as peak oil. Every president in the 70s of the U.S., Nixon, Ford, and Carter, made reference to his research, indirectly at least. At the time, in 1956, a lot of the geology community, the geologists, rejected what he had to say, ridiculed it, but within a few, not even a few decades, within about 15 years, it became absolutely obvious that what Dr. Hubbard had been referencing was underway, was evident, and the U.S. had quite a transition as it shifted from being a net exporter of fuel to a net importer of oil in particular, actually, around 1970. So U.S. consumption rose dramatically with demand going up and with the capacity to pay going up. And so the U.S. started to import oil from other places, places like Mexico, Canada, Venezuela, the Middle East, and so on. It was a pretty significant shift in the economic patterns of the U.S. and of course of those other places that were benefiting from all that money that the U.S. was spending in those places. So the geology, along with the economics or the technology, the physics of fossil fuels, predicted certain other outcomes, certain political changes, and so forth. With a clear, realistic recognition of some presumptions, I can review those presumptions ongoingly to see if they're accurate, see if they're useful. With a clear, realistic recognition of some presumptions about basic physical realities, like the amount of oil in a particular geographic area, and with clear, realistic recognition of the presumptions of about the language models that people are using, like, including me, herds of people are using to interpret and relate to their presumptions about physical reality. We connect all this stuff together. There's all these layers of clarity, which always include presumptions. I'm clear about presumptions, my presumptions and the presumptions of other people. And then I'm also clear about measurements, actual measurements. And in fact, even measurements are presumptive. If I say there's 60 million barrels of oil used every day in the U.S., well, no, there's not. Some days it's 61 million, and some days it's 59. But we can, make these relatively accurate statements that are somewhat presumptive and somewhat accurate. And we get to explore how accurate we want to be, how presumptive we want to be. Once we're clear about the basics of economics, geology, and so on, then even things like the formation and transition of political systems and governments and court systems of organized violence and so on, then we can begin to study the contrarian socionomics of Eliot and Prechter. I'm going to refer to what I mean by contrarian and socioeconomics, or socionomics. Contrarian means recognizing that the masses have a tendency to be wrong at certain major transitions, like when 95% of the people are really into telegraphs, there's only like 5% of people that haven't gotten becoming users of telegraphs. So once the trend is really, everybody's into telegraphs, there's not many more people left to continue the trend. So it's predictable that prices of telegraphs will go down at a certain point once 95% of the people are into them and have them. Any technological advances are just going to blow away the prices. In fact, when 95% of the people are into telegraphs and only 5% are into telephones, what if the 95% of people who are into telegraphs recognize that telephones are actually kind of attractive and they stop using telegraphs and switch over to using telephones? There's a huge opportunity when only a small minority of people are into something and then the majority follows the minority. That's really the whole basis of prudent investing, is look for the minority pattern of behavior that's gaining momentum so much that the majority may shift over. That's the thing to invest in. That's the thing to study. What's the minority thing that the majority is just about to really pick up and get into, such as when there was a transition away from telegraphs towards telephones. So when lots and lots of people are into telegraphs, not much opportunity left in that industry, at least not within that particular geographic area. You have what's called saturation. So that's contrarian, the word contrarian. That's what that's about. Now, socionomics means the connection between social psychology of herds and then their behavior, the perceptions and psychology and attitude and interpretive presumptions of herds and their actual behavior, and how those things change over time. That's basically my on-the-fly definition of socionomics. So we're clear about basics of economics, basics of geology, basics of language, basics of contrarian principles, of how the majority may suddenly shift over towards something that only a minority are already aware of. And then we can get into specifics of measurement. We can measure what's called technical analysis. Those measuring systems have been trailblazed by mathematicians, mostly folks like Pythagoras, Fibonacci, Gann, Mandelbrot, and John Nash. So I'm going to back up again to a general comment. Commerce and politics and propaganda, political systems, right? Culture, those are all phenomenon that are predictable based on other observations. The reality of geology, of geography, technology, anthropology, psychiatry, neurochemistry, lots of things can be used to predict, lots of things that don't change much, like human DNA, can be used to predict things that can change quickly. And of course, human DNA can change over generations. You know, the number of blonde people on the planet has gone up dramatically in the last 10,000 years, for instance. So, let's see. So some fields predict large-scale patterns of behavior with relative imprecision, like the behavior of local weather, or the temperature of the whole planet, or the behavior of a specific hurricane. They're pretty big phenomenon, relatively speaking. While other fields focus on predicting a very precise set of, phenomenon, like a particular organism, a particular individual, such as exactly how many units of alcohol will it take for an organism to pass out or die, which can be measured much more precisely, predicted much more precisely. So the broader the kind of prediction we're making, like the weather or the movement of hurricanes or the planet's temperature, the more difficult it is to measure things. It can be more difficult if I say, what's the temperature of the planet going to be in 98 years from now? Well, that's a little bit hard to project. And obviously we have to wait quite a while to see if that's accurate. So with some kinds of science we can make projections and test them because they're just immediate to us. So other things, like I made some forecasts in 2003 that weren't evident as obvious until at least 2005, and even then many people didn't recognize what I was saying was inevitable or extremely likely. Even then many people ridiculed or resisted admitting those things, and even today, if I were to say to you or anybody else some of the basic observations I made in 2003 that are plainly evident by what's happened in the last 9 or 10 years, many people would still reject those explanations, even though they recognize the reality of the results, the things that happened they acknowledge, but they don't accept the connection between the actual precise sequence of events of those things being predicted, then happening in that sequence, and the analysis of why those things happen. Why? Because they might not like what is implied by a future projection of that same explanation. So, with very precise things like biochemistry, we can be much more precise in our predictions. If I'm trying to estimate the price of a particular company in 5 years from today, on that day at opening of markets in 5 years, what's the price going to be? That's pretty tough. So with biochemistry, we can even venture to predict things like how the hormone levels of oxytocin will affect the precise behavior of a particular group of people, a herd that are addicted to gambling on borrowing money to speculate on flipping real estate. At least we can say, how is different levels of oxytocin likely to affect the behavior of these people? Cortisol, adrenaline, and so on. How is it likely to go if all of our other presumptions are accurate? If all other factors remain stable? If all other underlying circumstantial trends or circumstances, if all circumstances remain pretty much the same, then we can say, okay, the presence of oxytocin is going to correlate in this particular way, or the presence of certain amounts of oxytocin. We can measure it, and we can say, okay, look, right there, you see right there what happened, and the brain did this, and then, then the person stood up, and then they went over, and they did blah, blah, blah. So it's very easy to reference the mechanical nature of biochemistry, but some people ridicule or resist the idea that there's predictability in regard to things like housing market prices. At the same time as they say things like housing markets or prices of housing always rise. They make predictions, but then they deny the idea that housing markets are predictable, at least if somebody's offering a prediction that is contrary to their preference. So it's important to recognize that all prediction is based on presumption. If I predict local weather without recognizing that there's a hurricane 500 miles away but heading straight for that local area, that is okay. That's not really a problem as long as I consistently reevaluate the relevance of the presumptions that I'm clear are only presumptions. So if I'm clear they're presumptions, I keep reevaluating them. And if they get, violated, then I go, oh, my presumptions were violated. Let's reassess. I don't say, who's to blame for this? What's wrong with my involve my models, my conceptual models, my labels of language, my projections of how things are likely to be. So another obvious thing is that when people have no competence in prediction, but they're making predictions, like real estate always rises, then rather than refine their model of predictive presumptions, they want to change things. They want to conflict with reality. They get in a struggle with reality. They may not even admit that they have predictive presumptions. They don't admit to having any idealistic presumptions. They just say, well, real estate always rises. That's not a presumption. That's true. That's not idealism. That's not a belief. That's a fact. Well, as long as it's not a superstition, it's reality. As long as people don't recognize a presumption as a presumption, then they can never reevaluate it. There has to be that breakdown of realizing that a presumption is presumptive before they can actually evaluate it and refine their presumptions. So people who have no competence in prediction tend to want to change reality to fit their ideals of what should be, of the right way to have my life be, the right way for God to have already made my life, or the right way for God to have already made real estate markets, or whatever it is. When people have competence in prediction and a confidence in their competence, then they tend to initiate leadership instead of complaining and blaming and agonizing and trying to fix things. They tend to initiate leadership, like they want to participate in the opportunity of progress, like transitioning from telegraphs to telephones, rather than resist it and avoid certain patterns and prevent them and and go on campaign to have the government save the telegraph industry and repress the horrible telephone industry, which is disrupting the telegraph industry, and it's just horrible, it's evil and all that. So you can tell a lot about someone's competence in the art and science of forecasting by the language they use about forecasting, such as, could we have predicted what's happening now? And if so, could we have prevented it? When people say, could we have predicted it, that means they haven't. And could we have prevented it means they want to. It's like a physician or someone learning physiology saying, that is an incurable condition. What does that mean? That means they don't know how to cure it themselves. They haven't developed enough understanding to know how that set of symptoms forms. They don't know what to do about it. They don't know how to predict how different treatment interventions will affect it. So they don't venture to say, well, I have mastery over that. They just call it, oh, that's an incurable illness, as if that's inherent in the illness rather than a reflection of their level of understanding of physiology. So it's to even ask, could we have predicted something, is a little weird. It's clearly a display of ignorance. It means that, if somebody sincerely asks, could we, it's a display of curiosity too, could we have predicted this, summer being so hot again? Well, it means that they're not ignorant of the fact of, even the existence of summer. They'll just say, well, why does it keep getting, I noticed that I noticed the moon changing phases, and every 10 or 12, cycles of the moon, it seems to come back to being really hot. What's that about? And they start to make correlations and models and so on. So when people are ridiculing forecasting or are asking, is forecasting possible? Is weather forecasting possible? Is economic forecasting possible? Well, that is a display of ignorance. And a lot of times people are frightened, and what they're frightened of, they'll ridicule. And that can be labeled with, that can go along with arrogance, frustration, like, this is not the result I prefer, or my forecasting model didn't work, and I'm frustrated that it didn't work, and so on. Then they may want to blame people for, why did my inaccurate model, why is it inaccurate? Who's to blame for interfering with my model's accuracy? Well, it's just an inaccurate presumptive model. So they can get into animosity, contempt, and so on. So again, this is about psychology. This is evidenced in political discourse in the following little parody. Why are all the blank so negative and disrespectful? Why the hell are those blank people so frustrated? Why do they have so much blank anger and contempt and arrogance? What's the problem with those people way over there that are so unlike reasonable, decent, respectable people like you and I? In politics, people will sometimes use some pretty strong tones and expletive terms, and as they refer and as they complain about other groups or other individuals, and as they, maybe some proposal, some campaign, some political initiative or political pattern that's developed, and that's all predictable. For the Union to invade the Confederacy, totally predictable. For the European Union to form, totally predictable. How do I know? Lots of people predicted it. In fact, people wrote about that for decades prior to it happening. They planned it. They went out of their way to create it. They said, this is what we're up to creating. And other people ridiculed that, ignored that, condemned that, in some cases.